Without any further ado, I would love for you to please give a warm ShmooCon welcome to KatieNickels on why we need to stop panicking about 0 days.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the ShmooCon staff, for all the volunteers, for having me to give a talk that I don't know every conference would accept. As you said, I'm KatieNickels. My day job is as the Director of Intel Ops at Red Canary. I get to lead the Intel and Thrunting teams, also SANS instructor, and a fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I should say, because like half the audience is MITRE, I used to work at MITRE on the attack team. So yes, they steal all the tickets, blame them. So what we're going to talk about today is 0 days. And rather than trying to scare you, I'm going to go in the opposite direction and talk about maybe why we don't need to panic all so much. So we have an ambitious agenda today. We're going to kick off talking about what the problem is, what I've observed. Maybe you've observed it too. Then I'm going to dive in and talk about why it's important for us to think not just about the 0 day, the vulnerability, but beyond that, how it's exploited in the full chain. We're going to dive into specific evidence about 0 days, right? The scariest type of vulnerability, and oh, they're so prevalent, everyone's using them. Let's dig into what the evidence says there. Then we're going to talk about how we can find some calm by looking at common exploitation patterns, and then we'll wrap up talking about planning in advance, and then how we as a community can kind of do a little bit better to reduce the panic. I know we have a bunch of students here, which is awesome, newer people to the field, so I wanted to start hitting some definitions, and you'll see different definitions. These are mine. I'm calling a vulnerability any kind of flaw or weakness in code, in hardware and software that can lead to something unintended. In our context, usually that's something bad, like remotely executing code or escalating privileges. And then within that umbrella of vulnerabilities, there's a 0 day vulnerability, right? This is something that only the researcher or the adversary knows about. It's not known publicly. Different interpretations of why it's called 0, but maybe there are 0 days to respond to it. So those are our definitions as we get started. So what's the problem here? Why did I feel passionately enough to come up here and rant at you just a little bit? Take a look at this, and I'd like you all to participate at the end of the day, but you have some energy. Ever heard something like this? This 0 day is going to be really bad. Cancel your weekend plans. Anyone? Raise your hand if you've heard something like that, maybe from a friend on social media. Decent number of people. Okay, it's not just me. Often a random person on the internet says it. Every Friday. Today, actually, I think there's a Juniper 0 day out. So cancel your weekend plans, everyone. No. Stay here at ShmooCon. So why do we do this? I have a couple of hypotheses, opinions that I have on why. First off, groupthink. Right, this is a common cognitive bias in my favorite field, threat intel, where everyone starts to think the same way. Well, if I see my team or someone on the internet that I trust panicking about a vulnerability, a 0 day, I might feel like, well, I should panic too. So we all kind of stir each other up, so to speak. The other reason, right, we want to be good at our jobs. We want to take these things seriously. If there's a scary vulnerability people are talking about, I want to take it seriously. So maybe that ups my panic level. I also feel like there's an aspect here of we want to feel like what we do and the work we do is important. And so obviously if we panic, that means that what we do is really important, of course. Well, the reality is, like, you all do important work. We do important work together. You don't have to panic to try to prove that. So why do I think this is a problem? A couple reasons. First off, shiny object syndrome. Let's say today you were doing some foundational work, implementing analytics, doing some asset inventory. Instead, this Juniper 0 day comes up and you're like, ooh, shiny. Let's go dive into this and ignore maybe higher impact work than chasing a vulnerability in software that maybe you don't even have, right? The other thing that I like to highlight about this, we as a community have a problem with burnout, mental health. What we do is intense, and it can be tough, long hours. And my feeling and observation is that ramping each other up and panicking about 0 days, about incidents, about breaking news, just leads to more stress, and that contributes to burnout. If we're burnt out, right, we're not going to be effective. Like, take care of yourself first. So I really think this is why we need to talk about this as a community. So let's dive in and try to get to some calm. I want you to think of a vulnerability like an opportunity, like an unlocked or open door. So let's say I go on vacation for a week to a nice tropical beach and I accidentally leave my door unlocked. Well, that sucks, but I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood. My neighbors watch, so the reality is that's not a problem unless someone comes through that open door. It sounds really obvious when I'm talking about my front door, but we forget this with vulnerabilities. If a threat doesn't exploit that vulnerability, if a person doesn't go through that door, it's not a problem. And for whatever reason, sometimes adversaries choose not to go through open doors even though they exist. The other thing I want to point out with this metaphor, in an ideal world, I would lock my door. No one would get in. But I'm paranoid, I have a security system. So let's say that someone does get through my front door. Well, my motion detector goes off, alarm goes off, scares them away, they leave before stealing my TV. Well, I wish they didn't get in my house, but that's better than them stealing my TV, right? Same thing applies in cyber intrusions. In an ideal world, no one gets in our environment, but if they do, it maybe isn't the end of the world. Probably heard of some version of an intrusion chain, a kill chain. Whatever version you want to use, this is what's powerful about this model, right? So many vulnerabilities are what I call kind of initial access vulnerabilities. They're in internet-facing devices. They often will allow remote code execution. And so if one of those vulnerabilities is exploited, right, the adversaries get in. The reality is there are going to be flaws in code. We can try to prevent that, work on secure design, but there are going to be those vulnerabilities. You can't stop every vulnerability from existing. But the good news is, after adversaries exploit that vulnerability, they do a bunch of other stuff, right? This is just an example. They execute code, they do reconnaissance, they move around. They don't want to just land on the appliance or device or software that had the vuln. They want to get elsewhere. And then they want to do bad things like steal or encrypt data. So maybe you can't stop that vulnerability from being exploited, but you have so many opportunities here to detect and mitigate and stop this before it gets to the really bad stuff. Let's dive a little bit into 0 days themselves. All right, I know it's the scariest concept. We have a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt because it's the fear of the unknown. And there's an assumption that advanced actors, that so many actors are going to use 0 days all the time. Well, let's take a look at some evidence on what that usage actually looks like. So CISA did analysis in 2022 of what are the vulnerabilities, what years are the vulnerabilities that are most commonly exploited by actors. And I would say if it's true that 0 days are the most prevalently exploited type of vulnerability, we would expect, right, almost 100% of the routinely exploited vulnerabilities to be that same year. Their analysis showed this wasn't the case. Over half of the routinely exploited vulnerabilities from 2018 and 2021, before that current year of 2022, showing that, hey, maybe some of these older vulnerabilities are still being exploited. Another analysis from the Gray Noise team, a resource I highly recommend. I think their new version of this exploitation report is coming out soon. They looked at CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. Again, a catalog of everything CISA knows about that's been exploited in the wild. And they mapped each of those to the year that vulnerability was disclosed. Again, if more recent, 0-day type vulnerabilities were prevalent, we would expect to see, right, everything here at the right. But instead, what they noted, 77% of exploited vulnerabilities in that catalog were older than the current year. Right? Take a look back. Adversaries are exploiting vulnerabilities that date back to 2007 even. But what about the APTs? And I can give a whole separate ranty talk about APTs, advanced persistent threats, those state-sponsored actors. Well, they're advanced, so they're going to use 0 days, right? Okay, not always. Right? This is a report on the threat group APT28, a Russian state-sponsored group who was exploiting a vulnerability in Cisco routers from 2017. As recently as 2021, if I had to guess, might still be exploiting that. even advanced actors exploit older vulnerabilities because 0 days are hard to find. They're not going to burn them if they can exploit an older vulnerability. That's what the evidence shows us. That said, the evidence also shows us, yes, sometimes 0 days are exploited, but we have good news about that as well. One of the ways we can find calm around 0 days is knowing that there are common exploitation paths adversaries commonly will use. The 0 day, we don't know what it is, but the good news is maybe we can anticipate the paths they will follow after they exploit that 0 day. We can use threat intelligence, knowledge of adversaries, to create these high-level paths or models. Here's a high-level one that, credit to my teammate Tony, right? This is based on my team, other folks' research. We commonly see this pattern. Adversaries will find a 0 day in some kind of internet-facing device or appliance. VPN appliances, firewalls, there are a lot of these. Adversaries focus on those because a lot of times people aren't monitoring them and they're facing the internet. So a great target for finding vulnerabilities. So adversary exploits those 0 days in that appliance, and they get on that appliance. A lot of adversaries love to drop web shells to execute code and persist. Maybe they do some other bad things on that appliance. But if they're just on one appliance, they can't do as much badness, so they want to move around. They move laterally to other parts of the network. Then ultimately, very technical here, they do bad things in other parts of the network. This is where things like MITRE ATT&CK can be helpful, because as you start mapping these chains, what you'll see is similar techniques coming up over and over again. This is what my team has found. The other reason having this kind of high-level model or path is helpful is it also helps us anticipate and think about if there is a new 0 day that might map to this model, where can we get the best visibility? A lot of people don't think about the fact that many of these perimeter-facing appliances have no monitoring. Usually EDR sensors are not installed there. They just kind of hang out facing the internet, which is a little bit scary. But the good news is, right, you do have a better chance of catching as the adversary moves out of that appliance, moves to other parts of the network. Shout out to the Velexity team who does awesome research. And I was preparing my slides and I was like, oh, perfect. A headline from Wednesday about 2 new 0 days in a VPN appliance. I made this model ahead of time. Let me see if it fits. Sure enough, it does. 2 vulnerabilities, 2 0 days in a VPN appliance. Then adversaries modified legitimate files, added a web shell in that VPN appliance. Then they move laterally. This is not magic. It's threat intelligence, knowing what actors like to do. And one of my first guesses of how adversaries are going to move laterally, common protocol, remote desktop protocol, RDP is going to be one of my first guesses. That's one of the ways they moved. Then ultimately did bad things, used web shells. In many intrusions, you can reasonably anticipate adversaries are going to dump credentials as well. And that's what they did. Really high level, but hopefully you can see the power in taking this from, oh my gosh, there are new 0 days, to, hey, wait, let's back up. Even if this Velexity blog wasn't public, and there's also research from Mandiant on this, right, you might be able to hypothesize, well, they probably are going to move off that appliance. We know how to look for lateral movement. We know how to look for credential dumping. Focus on the aspects that you can detect and mitigate. From there, you can play a little game of mix and match, kind of a game of Clue, right? Colonel Mustard in the library with the wrench. This is theoretical, but right, insert your appliance and technique of choice. Maybe it's ImPacket for lateral movement. Maybe they steal data at the end. Let's shuffle. Okay, maybe it's a Fortinet appliance. Maybe they use RDP. Maybe they do some crypto mining here. What you'll find if you start analyzing more and more of these intrusions, there's a lot of things that adversaries could do, but there's a handful of techniques of what they most commonly do. Again, knowing this, planning out these models, even if they're high level and simple, can help you get more confidence, right, as you seek to anticipate and then respond to whatever 0 day or vulnerability you might be facing. Let's talk about how defenders and then we as a community can do better. Plan. right? A lot of people have incident response plans, but I don't know that everyone has plans for how to deal with vulnerabilities. Again, the reality is vulnerabilities are going to happen, so plan in advance how your team's going to handle them. Again, bringing a sense of calm. First step, a lot of people miss this one. I know it seems obvious, but are you even affected by it? Right? There was a vulnerability in a Juniper appliance, an operating system today. Do you use it in your network? If you don't, cool, definitely don't need to cancel your weekend plans. This is where foundations like an asset management system really matter. Maybe go talk to your accounting team, because if you're paying for software, they probably know about it. That's one place I found that people overlook. Next thing, think about what type of vulnerability it is. CVSS scores can help here, but just thinking the basics. Is this a remote code execution vulnerability, right? In maybe an internet-facing appliance, that's probably going to be worse than something like a privilege escalation vulnerability that an adversary might need to already be in your network to exploit. All vulnerabilities are not created equal, so think about what type you're dealing with. Next, bring in your threat intelligence. The first question I ask about any vulnerability, has anyone seen it being exploited? Again, if a person doesn't go through that open door, it's not quite as concerning. This is where you use threat intelligence, right? I'll give you a list of resources, people that I think release great research about adversaries exploiting vulnerabilities. This is also where, if you prepared in advance and thought about those common exploitation paths, refer back to those, especially if there's not a lot of information. Next, think about how tough it is to fix it, or if you might just have to implement some mitigations. Those of us, myself included, who have never been a system administrator, often will say, just patch. Well, if there are any sysadmins in the audience, you're probably like, it's not that easy. I have chatted with folks who have tried to patch some of these things. It's a lot of downtime, it's a lot of work. And so if you assess you can't necessarily patch it immediately, maybe there are other mitigations. Then, after you've done all of that, then take actions. Yes, if you can patch, patch. I'm not saying to ignore vulnerabilities. I'm saying understand them, understand how and if they affect you, then take action. Also realize sometimes you might not be able to patch immediately. You might have to have other mitigations. That's also where those common exploitation paths come in, right? Looking to those techniques that we might see if we can't patch immediately. So those are all focused on if you're defending a network or a bunch of networks. As a community, we can also help each other calm down a little bit. Big one, don't spread FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If you see someone freaking out and telling everyone to cancel their weekend plans, don't reshare that. Ignore it, turn it off. You have an option of what you consume and what you share. Use that. Instead, share useful information. Right? If you have information about a mitigation that's worked for you, share that. If there's a great blog post from Velexity or others, share that. If you have an analytic that will help catch this, share that. Share useful information, not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The other aspect, and there are other talks, amazing talks at ShmooCon about this, right? Anyone who's a developer, think about secure code practices, secure by design, then maybe we'll have fewer vulnerabilities to deal with. Here's some recommended sources. I will post my slides a few minutes after I finish up, so you don't need to take a screenshot or anything here. A lot of these folks are vendors. I'm good if vendors share useful information, awesome. Others like CISA, MITRE ATT&CK, of course, I have to mention. If you search for exploitation for, you can see all the different techniques relating to vulnerability exploitation. I have to call out CISA, great advisories, and their known exploited vulnerability catalog. Very, very useful in figuring out how the adversaries actually exploited this. And again, if anyone's trying to scare you or tells you to cancel your weekend plans, probably avoid those sources. As we wrap up, we've covered a bunch in just under 20 minutes, I hope. Big message, you do not need to panic about 0 days if you don't want to. Talked about my concerns, it contributes to burnout and stress in our community. Remember, vulnerabilities are open doors. Threats have to exploit them. We can use that to our advantage. We can use that knowledge of common exploitation paths to make us feel calmer, to get a handle on what threats are doing. Plan ahead. Don't just have an incident response plan, have a plan for how you evaluate and deal with vulnerabilities. And then lastly, the biggest way we can stop this is just by refusing to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Share useful information that lifts each other's up, that helps us improve our defenses. Don't share FUD. That's all I have for you all. Thank you all so much. I think I'm right at time, so if you have questions, I'll just hang out for a few minutes. Thank you all. Thank you all for masking. Have a wonderful ShmooCon.